Now let's take a moment to reflect on an issue that often goes overlooked: the disparities in how human rights concerns are addressed globally. There's a stark contrast in how civil rights violations in Western countries are received compared to similar issues in the non-Western states. While symptomatic racism, racial profiling, and excessive policing in places like the United States have sparked significant domestic criticism, most notably through movements like Black Lives Matter, they rarely provoke the same level of international condemnation or sanctions on a human rights abuse elsewhere. Consider the pivotal of indigenous population in Western countries like United States, Canada, and Australia. For decades they have faced economic barriers, culture erosion, and institutional neglect. In Canada, for example, the devastating legacy of residential schools left deep scars on indigenous communities. Many Native Americans areas across the US continue to endure poverty and poor living conditions. While these issues are often documented in official reports, the global response is far less intense compared to the scrutiny directed at non-Western nations. The media coverage plays a critical role in shaping this disparity. Prominent Western media outlets frequently highlight human rights abuse by rival powers such as Russia or China, ensuring these stories remain in the global spotlight. In contrast, human rights violations within the Western nation are often downplayed or framed as symptomatic or unintentional. This framework influences public opinion and determines which issues receive priority at the international forums like the United Nations Human Rights Council or the European Court of Human Rights. Nowhere is this double standard more apparent than in the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. Nowhere in double standards more apparent in the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. Let's look at the European Union response to Ukraine refugees compared to those fleeing crises in the Middle East or Africa. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the EU activated its rarely used Temporary Protection Directive. This policy allowed 8 million Ukrainians to bypass lengthy asylum processes and immediately access work, education, healthcare, and freedom of movement within the member states. It was a remarkable show of solidarity and compassion. But this contrasts sharply with how Europe has treated refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia in the past. During the 2015 refugee crisis, many European countries built physical barriers, conducted pushbacks at sea, and entered into controversial agreements such as the EU-Turkey deal to prevent migrant flows from Middle East and North Africa. Refugees who managed to arrive were often confined to overcrowded facilities in places like Lisbon, or left stranded in transit countries such as Libya and Turkey. Many of these individuals faced limited humanitarian aid and frequent human rights violations. These restrictive measures were often justified on the grounds of security or integration challenges. Yet such justifications were notably absent when it came to Ukraine refugees. Critics argue that this discrepancy highlights the deep-seated ethnic, culture, and religious bias. Ukrainians are predominantly white, Christian, and European, perceived as more relatable and familial, while Syrians, Afghans, Somalians, often Muslims speaking non-European languages and influenced by their culture traditions, face greater suspicion, prejudice, as well as bureaucratic hurdles. Research from organizations like the Refugee Council and the European Council of Refugees and Exiles has shed light on these discriminatory patterns. Non-European asylum seekers frequently experience lower processing times, lower acceptance rates, limited access to education or employment opportunities. This systematic inequality undermines the very ideas of equality and human rights that Europe claims to uphold. Some officials in Europe pushed back against these accusations, urging that the swift response to Ukraine refugees was due to the directness of Russian aggression, geographical proximity, and logistical feasibility. But critics counter that no comparable urgency was displayed during prior humanitarian crises. For example, Syrians fleeing destructive of their homes during civil war, Afghans escaping the Taliban, and Somalia trapped in prolonged conflicts did not receive the same level of support. Studies from Europe Parliament have shown that emergency measures granted to the Ukrainians were not extended during these early crises, exposing a selective pattern. This dual-tier refugee system has far-reaching implications. On one hand, it undermines Europe's claim of moral leadership and a commitment to universal human rights. On the other hand, it shapes global perception of what the West credibility. On the other hand, it shapes the global perception of the West credibility. If Western nations selectively champion human rights based on ethnicity, culture, or strategic interests, their moral standing on the international stage is inevitably called into question. The disparity in the way of human rights violations are addressed extended far beyond the experiences of refugees. A myriad of symptomatic issues persist in many Western countries, ranging from pervasive racial discrimination to marginalized treatment of indigenous populations. These critical aspects often do not elicit the same level of robust external scrutiny or pressure that one might expect in the face of such glaring injustice. For instance, while movements like Black Lives Matter have succeeded in drawing significant public attention to the urgent issues of police brutality and the systematic racism with the United States has particularly grave matters tend to rarely escalate into international sanctions or lead into demands for external intervention. This indicates a troubling inconsistency in the global response to human rights violations. In parallel, various reports and studies frequently recognize ongoing struggles faced by indigenous communities in the nations such as Canada, United States, and Australia. However, this acknowledgement seldom translates into substantial global outreach or action, highlighting yet another facet of the embrace on how different human rights issues are polarized and addressed internationally. The lack of consistent and vigorous application of global human rights standards demonstrates the need for a more equitable approach that addresses all forms of injustice with seriousness they deserve. Simultaneously, the issue of human rights violations occurring in non-Western countries often captures considerable attention, receiving condemnation that pushes for international response and corrective measures. This narrow perspective is not merely a byproduct of the media inclination, rather an underscore of the prevailing global power dynamics. Western countries endowed with their substantial ways over international institutions and shaping of media narratives frequently manage to evade rigorous scrutiny that they pose on other nations. This discrepancy raises important questions about fairness, equity, and global approach to human rights advocacy, revealing how power disparities influence the visibility and accountability of human rights issues on a worldwide scale. In conclusion, these inconsistencies matter. They matter because they reveal the bias and inequities that shape our world. They matter because they undermine the pursuit of genuine equality and universal human rights. They matter because they influence how nations and people are judged on global stage. To build a fairer, more just world, we must confront these double standards head on and hold our nations accountable. Regardless of their power, wealth, or influence, only then can we move closer to the ideas we claim to uphold. Leave a comment at the bottom. Let's keep the conversation going and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.